Great Kerry Mountains, I met with Captain Farrell and his money.
Hello there and welcome once more to my home. Today we're going to talk about closed and mothballed distilleries. And I'm going to talk precisely about my favourite 5 malts that's now gone and defunct. And the first one of these is Port Ellen, Rosebank, Glenlochy, Glenury Royale, and finally Banff. I came to Australia in 1974. Absolutely adored the country, loved it, fitted in perfectly. The only thing I found I could fault with this country was the availability of good quality Scots whisky. It just wasn't available, and it was hellish expensive to get it here to drink. Anyway, in 1982 my mother was taken quite ill and I decided to go back and spend a bit of time with her, and I built myself a house and started a nice collection of single malt whiskies, and it was absolutely wonderful to be able to ring up and say, send me down a bottle of Banff. I could do with a bottle of Glenury Royale. It was a wonderful to be able to just get it there on spec. In 1983 my mother died, unfortunately, and that was a severe blow. But then I got a double whammy when Diego closed down 3 of my very favourite distilleries all in one year. Port Ellen, Rosebank and Glenlochy. Closed the 3 of them down. I was devastated, absolutely devastated. But there's little or nothing we could do about it, so anyway, I'll explain that to you later. But for now, we'll start talking about the first and my first favourite, which is Port Ellen. Port Ellen was built on the shoreline, like all the Islay distilleries, because all the trade was obviously sea-bound. This was a whisky, an Islay whisky, that borderlined on perfection. It was the biggest tragedy for Islay and malt whisky drinkers when this distillery closed. This whisky was renowned and is now a collector's item. Fortunately, they left vast stocks of it, so it's still readily be available, but by God, you have to pay through the nose for Port Ellen these days. To give you some idea of the output of the distillery, they use 3,000 tonnes of peat a year and 350 tonnes of barley. They started to collect the peat in March. This really brings me back to my childhood, because I was evacuated to Ireland during the war, and I remember as a youngster going up to the peat bogs in Ireland because they burnt the turf. That was their only means of fuel for the fires. And I remember going up with my grandfather cutting peat. He used to have this special shaped shovel, cut the peat, throw it onto the bank, cut the peat, throw it onto the bank, and work his way along a long peat bank, and eventually all the peat was covered the bank. And then maybe 2 or 3 weeks later we'd go back to the bog by donkey and cart or horse and cart, and we'd turn every sod of peat over so the bottom half dried, turned it over, and then another 3 or 4 weeks after that we'd go up and we'd collect all the peat with barrows and put them into stacks, maybe 3 or 4 wide, so the air blew through them. That was the third process. And then after about maybe 2 more weeks or 3 more weeks, depending on the nice weather, if the weather was really fine, we'd go back up again and we'd collect all the peat in barrels and put them on the side and make a big stack of peat. I remember my proudest moment was having my own donkey and cart, and I was only maybe possibly 7 or 8 years old, but allowed to go up on my own and collect a cartload of peat. They used to have to be stacked, you know, like this, and then built in like this, so they came to a stoop, and you'd leave yourself a special hole at the front so you could drive the donkey. I was very, very proud to be able to have my own horse and my own donkey and cart and collect the peat. And that's very much like the peat on Islay was collected. If you've never smelt a peat fire, you've never smelt goodness. It's a beautiful, beautiful smell is peat. And peat into whiskey is, well, that's what makes whiskey. It adds an abundance of flavours to whiskey, does peat and smoke. Every genuine whiskey connoisseur loves Port Helen. Well, now I'm going to sample this treasure, this Port Helen. Lots of peat and citrus on the nose. Smoky. It's a wonderful bouquet. Spicy, well-rounded. You can taste the peat smoke in it, and it's malty. It's a wonderful, wonderful whiskey is this. The finish is long and lingering. A totally balanced, well-rounded whiskey that's nigh on perfection in my opinion. The second whiskey I'm going to speak about tonight is Rosebank, a wonderful distillery, a lowland distillery, opened in 1798. It was built on the side of a Falkirk canal, named because of the roses that grow on the side of on the banks of the canal, consequently Rosebank. This whiskey was a long time considered the premier lowland whiskey. It's really a wonderful drop, and in 1993 Diego closed the whiskey down. It was another tragedy. The reason being they had troubles with the effluent, and I think at that time we had to work to European standards and bring it up to European standards. Of course, this Diego considered this not viable because it was going to cost them approximately £2 million to solve the problem. Hopes was alive that Rosebank was going to open, but then, and excuse my French, some bastards over Christmas, metal thieves, broke into the old distillery and stole all the metal. But anyway, that put the final nail in the coffin of Rosebank. But it was a sad loss, a sad, sad day when they closed back Rosebank down. I had a wonderful experience here in Australia. I went down to see my brother-in-law, and we went into a, oh no, I better not name the retailer for fear of spoiling a good thing, but went into a retailer down in New South Wales near Sydney, and we just walked in, and as always I'll browse the whisky counter, and what do we see but 4 bottles of Rosebank, and my eyes popped out when I saw them, and when I saw the price I nearly fell over. $62, which was an absolute steal. So obviously the people didn't realise the value of the whiskey they were selling. Where they came from, I don't know, but nevertheless we grabbed the 4. We've grabbed the 4 bottles, and I've only one left. I could drink Rosebank till the cows come home. It's lovely, lovely whiskey, and now I'm going to have a taste of one. The nose is very, very distinguished and light, very light. Of course it's triple distilled, so that explains it. Lots of lemon and traces of sandalwood, which is quite unusual. Yeah. Please treat yourself to a Rosebank. I guarantee you'll enjoy it. I'm now going to tell you about Glenlochy. I have fond memories about this Glenlochy. I'll tell you a little tale. Many years ago in England, around 1967 or 68, the wife and I went on a short holiday up to Fort William. And we were on our way over to the Isle of Skye. We were in a place called Mallaig, heading for a place called Mallaig. Anyway, in Fort William, at Mallaig, I beg your pardon, at Mallaig, we parked our car on the docks, And while I went fishing, there were what they used to call coalies, fishing all over, and it was fantastic fishing, and I went and bought myself a line and started fishing. And when we came back to the car, somebody had dumped a load of herrings on the car. Obviously I'd parked in the wrong spot, and there must have been sick of tourists parking on the docks where they were unloading fish, so they dropped a load of fish on my brand new Hillman minx. So I tried to wipe it off the best I can. And this old guy came up to me, he says, oh, I said, that's a shame. He said, would you like to come home with me and use my hosepipe to help clean my car? He said, follow me. So we got in the car and went home to him, and I used his hosepipe, and he got me hot water because it was a gluey gunk that was on the car. Anyway, we washed it down, and I said, thank you very much indeed. I said, and I offered to give him some money. No, he said, come in and have a drink with me. And he brought out a bottle of Glenlochy. That was the first time I'd ever heard of it. Well, not heard of it, but certainly tasted it. And me and this old guy downed half a bottle. I have never forgot it, and I've never forgotten him. It's just one of these experiences you have with Scotch whisky. Anyway, Glenlochy, founded in 1898 by a bloke called McCandis, David McCandis. He built this distillery to take advantage of the whisky boom. The whisky was booming at the moment, but unfortunately, or maybe a year or not very long after the distillery opened, there became the Patterson crash. The Patterson crash happened in around 1898. There were some brothers, two brothers or three brothers, I forget now, which in Leith had opened this firm, and what they did, they accumulated a vast amount of whisky, and I mean a vast amount of whisky, especially aged whiskies, but it was all bought on the back of a bank overdraft. In them days, business was done but with what's called bills of exchange, and the bank didn't honour one of these bills, so consequently the Patterson brothers crashed, and the whisky business really hit the deck. Of course, the First World War came into it, and that stopped them, but it took a long time for Glenlochy and the rest of the whisky distilleries to recover from this cataclysm that happened through these brothers. Glenlochy Distillery, in one of the two whisky distilleries in Fort William, built on the banks of the Glenlochy River, but they didn't use the water from the Glenlochy River, they sourced the water from the River Nevis. It was a well-made, well-rounded, perfect whisky, but it was the most unlucky distillery. It was opened and closed more times than my front door. Glenlochy finally closed its doors in 1983. The whisky is available, but very expensive. It's a beautiful warm gold colour. Oh, light. Like lots of vanilla on the nose. I can certainly taste citrus, slightly oily, and nutty. Yes, nutty. By God, I love this whisky. I can taste peat on the finish, and it's long. I find it long and lingering. A very pleasant whisky to drink indeed. Next, we have Glenury Royale. This distillery was opened by Robert Barclay in 1828. This character was quite a personality in his day. He was a laird, he was a member of Parliament. Because he was a member of Parliament, we believe that he got permission from King William IV, I believe it was, to put the Royal in front of his distillery name. Now, for what that means is, the very few distilleries in Scotland had the Royal insignia attached to the distillery. One was Royal Brackler, and I believe that was, I think, please don't quote me on this or write to me, but I believe Queen Victoria's favourite whisky was Royal Brackler, so she gave permission for the Royal to be put in front of Royal Brackler. Another one was Royal Lochnagar, which was favoured by royalty as well. And that's why the insignia Royal is put in front of the distilleries. But for some obscure reason, he put it behind his distillery name, called Glenury Royale, instead of Royal Glenury. Unfortunately, Glenury Royale was accident prone. Only 2 weeks after it opening, the warehouses, the maltings, the kilns literally burnt to the ground. It was a huge, huge loss. And then 2 weeks later, a worker fell into the boiler and he never came out alive. Glenury Royale finally closed its doors in 1985. I believe there's a housing estate built on where the whisky lay. I will now go on to taste Glenury Royale. Nice, very nice golden colour. God, I can pick up almonds here, nutty, citrus. I can taste shades of vanilla in this whisky. I would say this is a classic example of a perfect Highland malt. It's absolutely lovely. And finally, Banff. Founded in 1824, ironically, it was burnt to the ground 50 years later. But the astonishing fact was that 5 months after that, which was a great achievement in its day, it was completely rebuilt and back in full production. During the Second World War, the Banff distillery was used to accommodate troops, and during this period a Nazi warplane came over and bombed the distillery and burnt it to the ground. Apparently, after this bombing, thousands and thousands and thousands of gallons of whisky was lost. It's said to have leached out of the distillery and into the country and into all the streams, and the cows in the paddocks around the distillery could not be milked because they simply couldn't stand up because and had the alcohol. Also the birds in the streams and the ducks, hundreds and hundreds of them died through alcoholic poisoning. In 1959, tragedy once more struck this poor unlucky distillery. A welder welding the copper stills caused an explosion which just about decimated the distillery again. They recovered but finally closed the doors in 1983. Now the reason Banff closed was poor water source. The water wasn't up to standard, and a sheer lack of it caused the demise of this distillery. We will now taste this splendid whisky. It's a beautiful copper colour, and this is really, really grassy on the nose. Lots of grass in this whisky. I can smell orange peel, and quite fruity as well on the nose. Vanilla, pick up vanilla and I'll tell you what, I pick up orange peel. It's beautifully balanced, and the finish is slightly smoky, long and lingering. It's a wonderful, wonderful drop of whisky is this. This is the end of this series. It's a sad thing to think that these fine whiskies no longer exist. Do, if you ever have a chance, to buy one and enjoy it. It's been a pleasure welcoming you into my home, and see you again sometime. Goodbye and good luck and slán.
Whack, fall, daddy-o, there's whiskey